Hey guys, how you doing? We're back with part 2 of the Void Dragon series, and today we're focusing on these epic power blades and of course the Blackstone. Now if you want to see how we got to this stage with the Void Dragon's skin and its corruption energy, check me out on Patreon. We'll talk a bit more about that later on. For now, here's where we're at. Here are our sub-assemblies. We talked all about this in the first part of the video. A lot of this we won't be touching today, but there's going to be a lot of Blackstone. In fact, I believe it's present on everything, even a little bit left on that little Necron dude there. Predominantly today we're going to be working on the mask coming up from the base and of course the altar that's there with all that power. And so let's get to it. Using a mix of Cabalite Green and Thramar Black. You only want a little bit of black in with this. We're going with a 4-to-1 mix, as always, thinned down with an equal amount of flow improvement. You need to get this all over the altar, all over these rocks. Now, I suggest that when you're painting these rocks, you're going to take one at a time and you go through all of the surfaces. It's very easy to miss one of those as you're going through it with an airbrush. You can make sure you get full coverage with this. As soon as that's all dried, take it some Cabalite Green, mix that 1-to-1 flow improvement, and now we're going to start getting our highlights down and bringing some shape to this. So all these areas on the bottom, we're highlighting the top edges of it because that's the way a natural highlight progression would work. We're going to make sure as well that we get all around the edges. And when we get to things like the altar, the stonework that's down there, we're going to leave just a little bit of recessed shadow. We want to make sure we get a fairly large amount of each of these steps. What we don't want is something that's really dark. We want it to have a nice depth, have a nice shadow to it, but we do want it to pop out quite well. And you can see from the background there just how well this is going. On the upright sections, we are making sure anywhere we've got that little channel with the circle in it, we're getting a highlight around there as well. And once that's all done, there you go, it's looking pretty damn spiffy. Now remember, we're not just focusing on this. This is where we're going to put the focal point of our video, but like I said, even these little guys have got it. Make sure when you get your highlights in on here, that you're leaving plenty of that background. Look there on the wings, we're just hitting that outside, making sure there's enough of that gap. And the first highlight pass we're doing here, we're going to do the entirety of this middle section. Don't forget as well, you're going to need to do it on this bad boy. Make sure, if you need to, just put a shield in the way so you're not going to get any of it on that skin. Speaking of skin, we're going to take some sickly skin and mix it in with our Cabalite Green. We're going to come in and we're going to start hitting some highlights on all of these, leaving a little of that initial area left behind. We want to make sure we get a nice progression and blend with our highlights. Now, if you're not sure why we've got these particular sub-assemblies, check out patreon.com/Mohawk Miniatures or twitch.tv/Mohawk Miniatures, where you can find me live 4 times a week. And of course on Patreon you can get guides just like this one. The last guide, the first part in the series, was all about the Void Dragon, how to get those sub-assemblies, how to get that beautiful skin tone, and of course that corrupted purple. So this is the base after all of those highlights have gone down. Just need to do that little bit of the altar. So let's come in and again just start by picking out those upper surfaces. Make sure we've got a nice transition from the darkest area to the lightest, and with the steps ensure that you're just hitting the edge. Now we're going to do a brushed highlight on top of this, and we're going to do plenty of shadows to it, give it some drama, but for now we just want to get a real nice in your face very bright green. Look at that now, loads and loads of highlights have gone down. That's looking particularly good. We're going to change all of this up in a minute, but before we get to that, we've got to go over to the wings, and we've got to do obviously the rest of it. Very, very carefully, just get that edge highlight on with this. This is having a massive effect on the overall tone of the Blackstone that we've painted so far. So you need to be sure you're basically shooting past the miniature and just letting the overspray do the work. On this side, anywhere you get one of those little cut-ins, just get a tiny little dot highlight, a bit of a specular highlight with the airbrush, using that rocking thumb motion if you need to on the trigger to ensure you get some good accuracy with it. And that's going to give us a set of like multi-layered look to it. Don't forget, of course, your little necron parasite that goes on his back, and how could you possibly forget the man himself? Again, be very careful you don't get any of this on the skin. Use a mask if you need to. Next up, we're taking some Army Painter Blue Tone. We've just thinned this down with some Flow Improver 1-to-1. No need to use their Quick Shade Mixing Medium for this. I'm going to give every single bit of Blackstone an all-over coat
with this. Now we could be brushing it on, and we're going to do that in fact in a minute with a different element of Blackstone, but for all of this, just for speed's sake, we're just going to get a solid coat of it down. What this is going to do is going to tint all of that Blackstone, push it to the blue side of the color spectrum, and while that's drying, we can get on with this. Using the same recipe as before, Cabalite Green and Thramar Black, mixed in that 4:1 ratio. We're just going to paint in all the areas around the crown of the Void Dragon. This is so close to the skin that I don't really want to run the risk, especially on the head, the focal point, of getting any of that on there. And I figured you guys could see how to do this by hand if you don't have an airbrush. Once that first coat is down, take some Cabalite Green, just in it raw this time, and get a nice smooth pass of it just down the outside edges. Put a little dot in that little recess there, that little circular area they've got at the end of these. You might need a coat or two to get a nice smooth and clean edge to this. Also, it's going to help you by going on a little bit thinner anyway, just to give room for this highlight to go on. Cabalite Green and Sickly Skin in a 2:1 mix this time, so slightly different to the airbrush quantities. And again, do the same thing, just hit those very, very edges, and look at that, you're getting a nice pop to what we've got going on with this Blackstone now. Don't forget as well, you're going to need to hit the inside parts of that, just get those little lines tucked in, and you'll be looking pretty grand. Once that's dry, of course, just like we've done to the rest of the Blackstone here, we're going to go back to that Army Painter blue tone. We're just going to thin it down with a little bit of water, just to help it get into some of those recesses. Paint that on over all of that, and then we'll be ready to get all of our highlights and so on down on the Blackstone that we've done. So if you're painting this by hand, that's the first steps for it. Instead of using the airbrush, it's going to give you an effect that is fairly similar, especially on a small surface. Now though, we're still taking our time with some shadows. We're taking some dark tone from Army Painter, painting that into the biggest and deepest recesses on all of these. This is going to help to darken down the overall effect of the Blackstone without changing the surface too much. So we're doing a recess shade. Some people call it a pin wash. A little bit tricky to see some of what we've got going on here on the camera, but do make sure any of the big bits of damage that you've got, any of those larger lines, you are getting that dark tone in. You can thin it with a little bit of water if you want to. You could even use a quick shade mixing medium that they supply. It's up to you. But essentially just make sure you can get your brush nice and controlled into all of those recesses. When you get to any step like this that's on the Blackstone with those letters, the necron glyphs, just brush over that. As long as your wash is thin enough, it will hit those cracks without really leaving much in way of a stain on the surface. And of course, do that to every single part of the Blackstone that we've got. Whether it's this, the main body, any of the floating bits that come off on those coruscating lightning arcs, whatever you might be. Now we're going back to a 2:1 mix of Cabalite Green and Sickly Skin. This is the same coat of paint that we used for the highlight on that Void Dragon. And we're making sure we hit all of the highlights on every single bit of this Blackstone. Now we don't want to do box highlights all around things a la the Heavy Metal team. We just want to make sure we're hitting the lowest edge of all of these bits of breakage, all of the cracks and crevices that we've got, especially to give us the highlight. Make sure you get the lowest edge of all of your necron glyphs as well. You want those to stand out. It's an excellent piece of detail that you've got on the miniature. Don't forget about it. Somebody sculpted that. Let's make sure it gets worked on. There's the base with all of those highlights on there, and it had a massive, massive effect. Now we've got that second highlight. I'm going to work on this guy for a bit though first. This is the parasitic necron, and we're going to start painting the silver for it before we can go on. So we've got some Vallejo Model Air metallic gunmetal mixed with some flow improver. We're just going to hit every single piece of metal on the miniature with this. This is a recipe for essentially how to paint your bone colored necrons. This is what the client wants. This is what the client's going to get. We're then taking some Model Air metallic silver mixed 1:1 flow improver, and we're doing a bit of a zenithal style highlight. So we're coming down for above, we're hitting even the bits in the tail that would be upward facing, just making sure we're holding the mini in a particular way so we can hit those areas nice and easily. It's going to give us a nice strong finish on this guy that's also going to be fairly reflective. We've got a decent set of steel on there now. But of course, that's just giving us some highlights to the metal. Now we need to do the Necron bug parasite dude himself. For that, we're taking some Xandri dust from Games Workshop. It's a solid color to use for your bone color Necrons. I find that it gives a pretty decent base coat. I'm going to get a couple of coats of this all over. You want to thin it down a little bit to ensure that you've got something that's going to leave you a nice smooth surface over a couple of coats with no brush strokes. Don't forget to do the claws as well. We want these to contrast to the skin of the Void Dragon. Remember, these hop over around his neck, over into the sort of clavicles as well. Now I'm going to take some Xandri Dust and Mouth White Highlight in a 2-to-1 mix and just essentially smooth out the paint job that we've just done. So it's going to help eliminate any brush strokes that we do have. It's also going to start laying down the foundation of our next airbrushed highlight. Don't be afraid too much of overspray with this. We've got a lot of washes and we've got a lot of highlights to do on the metal colours anyway, but do obviously try and be a little bit careful with your airbrush. Make sure you're not just sort of spraying it all over the place, giving yourself too much work to do. I'm going to up the concentration of Mouth White Highlight in there to go for a 1-to-1 mix between that and Xandri Dust. And now we're hitting those higher points on the Necron Parasite. You can see what an effect this is having. Now, if we didn't do that previous coat, this transition could be a little too jarring. I prefer it to be a little bit softer, hence why we went through that one extra step. And to be honest, even if you're doing it for an entire army, it's not going to take a lot of time out of your schedule. Definitely something that's easy enough to do. So make sure you've got a nice smooth blend there. As before, don't forget to do any of the claws and so on. And here he is, close up. Look at that nice, smooth blend that we've got there. Next up, this is one of my own secret recipes. It's the fake Reichland Flesh Shade. It's 24 drops of Flow Improver, 6 drops of P3's Bogan Brown, 5 drops of GW's Rhino's Hide, and 1 drop of Vallejo Fire Red. Now, why aren't I using regular Reichland Flesh Shade to shade in things like the back end of this and a little bit of a crease? Simply because if you put that through an airbrush, you frequently don't get the control that you want from it. By making this into essentially a set of acrylic paint, we're going to get something that's easy to control, that doesn't really speckle too much, and is going to be a much, much easier time of things, giving me this nice effect at the end. That recipe, super clutch. Go back, write it down. Trust me, you'll thank me for it. Next up, though, we're going to take some actual, real Reichland Flesh Shade. I'm going to use that to hit all of our recesses. Any little bits of battle damage like he's got here, make sure you get it into those. Obviously, those great big vents he's got on his back, make sure you get it in there as well, and the claws and so on and so on. Again, the reason why we didn't use this before was just because we didn't have the control, but now we want something that's super thin. That's going to give us the control that we need to get it into those recesses. With that fake Reichland, by the way, I'd strongly suggest mixing up a bottle or so of it to give you something that you can go back to every time without having to remember that mix. Now, going back to the silver, we're taking some Army Painted Dark Tone, heavily thinned with water. I used about 4 drops of dark tone to 2 drops of water, mixed it all together. This is going to give me a nice wash to go all over our metallics. One of the things this is going to do is going to help mask any of that airbrush overspray. There's actually a little just on the end of that arm there by the claw. By putting a solid black wash over it, that's going to take away almost all of that straight away for us. Get this all over the metallics, and then we're going to highlight up our cron. We're taking some Mouth White Highlight from P3. We're going to put this over all of the top areas. We're also going to highlight any bits of battle damage, the claws, everything you want from it. Because this is essentially the color we used for our blend through the airbrush on our workup, it's going to go in really, really nicely. It's going to provide a nice bright finish to the miniature. If you want an overall darker or grungier look, then just take a little bit of Xandri Dust, mix it in with this instead, and go on with that for a highlight. I really like the bright finish that this gives though, especially to those big edges. It really changes the tone of what we've got, but keeps it quite warm as well. So once all that's done, now we're on to the blades. This is one of the best parts. So paint the blade black. I didn't think you guys needed a guide on how to do that part. We're taking some ink that we've thinned with both double the amount of Flow Improver and the same amount of water. Now it's still going to speckle over black. That's just a given. It's too much of a color step change, but we want to make sure we get a really, really smooth coat on these blades. This is one of the quickest ways of doing power weapons. If you're painting a power weapon and you've got access to an airbrush, honestly, I'd strongly suggest you use this technique. Get a nice little pop at the front of it. You can even do up towards the back. In fact, we're going to go on and just hit some of those back areas now. With that, pop that out to give us a bit more contrast. Once you've got a solid coat of the white down though, we're going to start getting our shadows down. So now we're taking some carbon black ink from Liquitex mixed with Flow Improver 1-to-1. You don't need to worry about mixing this and thinning down as much as the white, but we're going to put our shadows back in. So we're going on now, we're really darkening down the area, and it's worth taking your time, maybe doing 1 or 2 passes and just ensuring you've got an absolute black in those areas. Try and keep it even, top and bottom of the claws, but remember, if you're doing power swords, power axes, the gradients and the zenithals and so on, they're completely up to you where you want them to be, but you can still follow this exact same method. Then the last thing we need to do is take some turquoise ink. We're thinning this 1 to 4 with Flow Improver for a really, really thin coat, and working, as you can see, from a little bit of a distance there to get this nice and even all over. Now you want to stop when your black areas are just showing turquoise through. This way, the ink, that's a very, very powerful pigment, is going to cover over all of those other areas and give you a solid turquoise / blue all the way through the blade. You can do this with any color ink you want. My own necrons, for instance, we've done it with red. Works really, really well with that. If you darken this down a little bit, like we did on the Marine Justicar we painted previously, again that works and you get a darker tone overall. Once that's done, you do need to highlight it now. First off, we're going to let that cure, and we're going to highlight all of the back, the spines of this Necron bug with some speed metal from Scale 75, one of the best bright metallics that you can get. Don't forget as well to do all these little vertebrae kind of things. Just highlight the sides of those. Remember, you get the top side from each angle with it, and then obviously need to make sure that we highlight all of the other metal areas of the bug. So all of these areas, hit the underside to every line that you've got. That's going to create a nice light highlight. So here, for instance, the line would sit above the silver we just put down, therefore the silver goes in that place. All of the things like the shoulders, the arms, etc., all of the areas that you could think of as bone for the Necrons, highlight the top sides of those. For this, we're taking a mix of Amarth Blue and Sickly Skin. Now, I will admit this straight out, I didn't film the first highlight of this, unfortunately, which is just straight up Scale 75 Amarth Blue, but the process is essentially the same. Get a highlight all around the outside of it, including into those darker areas. You can see we've got that contrast in there from our brushed highlight to our airbrush work that we put down earlier on. And then make sure you get a nice sharp highlight down the center of each one of those. Now, on all of the model blades from GW, you will see a nice little point to this. It's very tricky to highlight on a flatter surface. Take your time, make sure you're bringing your brush strokes directly towards you. That's going to make it easier, and of course concentrate on your paint consistency. Make sure you've got something that's not too thick. It's going to need to be able to flow very easily off your brush, and there you go. Power weapon, super fast, super easy. Now, to separate our sub-assemblies carefully, really carefully, with a craft knife, just get in there and then pop off those little bits of sprue that we glued on. You will then need to make sure that you clean up any of that area to give a nice smooth surface, so when we glue them together, it's going to fit together without an issue. And at this point, I'm going to glue together the entirety of the Void Dragon. We know that the next step, going to be on Patreon next Friday, is all of that purple lightning. It's going to be epic. We're going to do the gold spear as well, fading through into purple, and finish this guy off. So patreon.com/Mohawk Miniatures for part 3, the finale, and of course part 1, how to do that skin. Thank you very much for watching, guys. We'll see you next time. I'm going to leave you with this epic montage of the Void Dragon. Peace out.